was trying to kill myself so I could be with my mother. I feel as though once you're dead, you'll be able to be with the other people that are also dead.
What the hell does it all mean? I mean, you're here tackling kids, holding them to beds, sticking needles in them. Is that psychotherapy? What's going on?
It's the best we got. I'm serious. It's the best that we have. I mean, there are other institutions that, you know, maybe a little bit better, maybe a little bit more staff.
Three women who attended the Northwest Outward Bound School had ventured out for a hike as part of their program. They were to learn how to survive, alone and without modern utilities. They were expected to return unassisted. The following day, a storm struck the area, soaking their clothes and sleeping bags. For whatever reason, the three women did not turn back, despite these less than ideal circumstances. Days passed where their arrival was anticipated. Not the 30th or the 31st. There was no indication of their return. Following this troublesome event, a search party was sent on Saturday, September 4th, nearly a week after the initial storm hit. The women were located the same day. Pamela Sullivan, age 18, was found huddled for warmth in the cold snow. She had been in the company of her deceased companion, Laureen Lorette. Joyce Howden, the third hiker, met a similar fate. The two women who were claimed by the elements had died the day before their discovery. Perhaps this was purely unfortunate coincidence, being at the mercy of nature. But there is a layer of irrational behavior here. The storm which disrupted their hike had struck soon after they left, which would indicate that retracing their steps would be the most logical course of action, assuming the path they took was a clear-cut trail. But this leaves the question, why didn't they turn back? What was the driving force behind their hike? Why did these three women take their chances with nature over returning to their school? What could possibly be worse than slowly freezing to death over the course of 5 days? Although you might perceive this case as a mere coincidence, such tragedies are unfortunately not unique to this one school. Since the 70s, there have been dozens of deaths featuring more violent and abusive cases all over the United States. As one delves further into the abhorrent history of these places, freezing to death almost sounds like a mercy killing. Almost.
We're not God.
What about making him better?
I can't do it.
Predominantly unregulated and scattered throughout the United States, these privately run facilities are plentiful and predatory. An estimated 50,000 youths are forced into these behavioral treatment programs annually, the efficacy of which is dubious at best. But despite this, an estimated 100,000, if not more, concurrent children are in the belligerent care of these facilities at any given time. These boot camps, boarding schools, and various other programs make up what is known as the troubled teen industry, or TTI for short. The TTI treats normal teenage behavior as though it's some sort of disease in need of a cure. But as we'll soon see, the methods employed are more barbaric than they are educational or therapeutic. First and foremost, let's go back, far enough to see what watered the roots of this corrupt industry and turned it into what it is today. The drug rehabilitation cult, Synanon. Founded in 1958 by former alcoholic Charles E. Dedrick, Synanon aimed to change the American public's view on drug addicts. Prior to Synanon's inception, addicts would typically be introduced to their new prison cell instead of receiving appropriate medical treatment. With this past substance abuse providing ample experience, Dedrick sought to promote the idea of ex-addicts consulting those who have found themselves struggling and striving for change. A tough love approach was the primary method of treatment used. But the results spoke nothing of love. Recovered members played crucial roles in expanding Synanon's influence across the US. By establishing drug treatment centers and therapeutic communities across the country, Synanon reached far and wide. And from these programs, the recovered patients would repeat the process. With each new facility, traces of Synanon could be found. But what exactly were those teachings? When thinking of tough love, you might imagine critical discussion over one's problems. Some might find the criticism harsh, but valid, in a majority of circumstances, so long as it applies to the actual ailment at hand. But this is so tame and mild, not the true Synanon way. Instead, members were required to partake in what was known as the game. The game is what is commonly referred to as attack therapy. The process is simple. One member would be forced to talk about themselves, their hardships, and their addictions, while enduring relentless critique by their peers. Members were encouraged to be as critical as possible about every single detail of their target. Screaming, yelling, and cursing at the target with the cult's collective vocabulary of obscenities gradually broke their will, leaving them submissive and compliant to Dedrick. The effectiveness of these attack therapy sessions was found in the duration. They would last for up to 72 hours, 3 days of a relentless emotional and mental abuse inflicted on an already vulnerable person, a brutal form of brainwashing. A complementary activity, referred to as the trip, would be carried out on weekends. Non-Synanon members would pay to accompany Dedrick and his followers on these retreats. The trip was a combination of group psychotherapy, mass hypnosis, vintage spiritual practices, and forms of mysticism. By loosening the minds of those involved, these trippers, as they were called, were forced to confess their hardships and crimes. With each day, the trippers would be pushed further and further, revealing more vulnerabilities to Dedrick and the cult. Following these sessions, trippers would receive homework that would take all night to complete. Sleeping was discouraged entirely, rendering them delirious and disorientated. By manipulating the trippers, Synanon managed to expand their reach while netting over $500,000 in their second year. The methods of manipulation proved to be rather effective, resulting in future facilities and programs to adopt similar styles of treatment, if you could even call it that.
Think about that. Come on.
It hurts me.
Think about what goes on inside. I'm lonely and it hurts me. Let's go.
I'm lonely and it hurts me.
Come on.
By the late 70s, Synanon's brutality became increasingly more apparent to the public. Paul Morantz, journalist turned lawyer, had sued the organization during mid-June 1977 on behalf of Frances Wynn, a 25-year-old Californian woman who had suffered from severe depression. She visited the Venice Family Planning Center nearby, one of the many facilities which had ties to Synanon's teachings and founder. Frances had requested a tranquilizer to ease her tension. Instead, a counselor at the center referred her to a Synanon office in Santa Monica. Despite having no drug problems, Frances complied. Upon reaching the office, her welcome was nothing short of a nightmare. Her hair had been shaved off, and the members restrained her, forcing her onto a bus destined to travel more than 400 miles away to a Synanon facility in Northern California. In the lawsuit, Frances Wynne asserted that she had been held captive by the organization. 9 days after her arrival at the facility, her husband and Mr. Morrance managed to persuade Synanon to release her. The following lawsuit awarded Frances and her husband $300,000 in damages. This one lawsuit sparked a fire in Morrance, leading him to obsessively work against Synanon, attempting to remove other members from the presence of their fanatic leader. But Morrance knew the risks. He knew that Dedrick would not take this intervention lightly. Morrance received innumerable death threats all throughout the night for months on end. What was most troubling to Morrance was the sudden end to the threats. He knew something was coming. In light of this, he promptly bought a firearm, preparing himself for the worst. During this time, he routinely scanned the underside of his car for any makeshift explosive, and repeatedly looked over his shoulder for anyone out of place. Despite his paranoia, all was quiet. On the evening of October 11th, 1977, Morrance returned home. Putting his books away for the night, he went to check the mail. Without his glasses, he could barely make out the outline of an odd package. It took a few seconds for the pain to realize and bleed through the shock. A rattlesnake had bitten the man, its rattler removed to silence it. With such a memorable experience ingrained in his mind, he recalls verbatim what he had said and thought in that moment. "They don't get me with this. I'm not that stupid. Call the police. Call an ambulance. I've been bitten by a rattlesnake. It's Synanon. Synanon got me." Following Synanon's disbandment in 1991, due to multiple members being convicted for a variety of crimes, resulting in the loss of its tax-exempt status, more organizations came to take their place. These organizations utilize similar tactics employed by their predecessor: strategic predatory marketing, which typically targets religious families who believe their teenagers' natural behavior is out of the ordinary. Tests which were provided by these programs would almost always result in a poor outcome, encouraging parents to ship their kids off until they were cured of their natural behavior. Some of you may be familiar with a certain Nexpo video, which detailed the brutal behavior organized by the staff at Elan, a private school in Portland, Maine, which remained active from 1970 to 2011. Students were beaten, belittled, and berated until they broke under the pressure. Fights between students would be orchestrated by staff. Punishment would be inflicted if anyone stepped even remotely out of line. On occasion, escape attempts would be made by students. Some were more successful than others in leaving the premises, but only by a small margin. Most would end up dead or return to the school. Whether a student escaped or not, the damage was done and the trauma was dealt. Tragically, such occurrences are not limited to a single school. Hundreds of programs have been the stage for bloodshed and abuse. Some have seen singular incidents, whereas others have had numerous deaths occur behind closed doors. Due to the sensitivity of the topic, many survivors prefer to keep their identities anonymous when retelling their stories. I'll be using pseudonyms when applicable. At age 14, Julia was sent on a week-long trip where she and her peers would presumably go on some kind of hike. The intent wasn't immediately made clear. The only information they received was that they were only permitted to bring what could fit in a 40-pound backpack, in addition to a sleeping bag. The kids were not informed of the harsh environment they would be forced to endure. We weren't told the nights would be freezing and to bring appropriate coats, boots, and clothes for the temperatures. We met in a parking lot and were immediately treated like criminals. Of the teenagers present, a number of them were visibly shaken. Some were agitated, while others sobbed. By the time they reached their destination, a thunderstorm was well underway, and the sun was setting. Each child was given a tarp and a small amount of iodine tablets to purify any water they came across. Supplies were limited and almost exclusively held for the staff. During the week, staff routinely threatened to deny the kids food if they fell behind or slowed their progress. Julia recalls a specific counselor. He would leave food lying out in the open, encouraging them to step out of line as an excuse to discipline them. After all of the torment and abuse began to come to a close, Julia came across a friendly dog at one of the rest stops on the trail. Feeding the lost dog with what little food she had, Julia had quickly grown attached to the troubled canine. When the hiking party reached the bus, Julia asked the only tolerable counselor if she could take the dog with her. There hadn't been any signs of people or houses anywhere, indicating that the dog was truly lost. Of course, there can't be a happy ending to such a story. Julia was forcibly dragged onto the bus when she refused to leave without her newfound friend, further traumatizing the poor girl. I cried all the way home, being yelled at by the counselors. I still have PTSD to this day, at the age of 51, about hiking, about bathroom trauma, about losing things. I carry immeasurable guilt for leaving that dog there. I still think about him as we pull away. For 11 months, Nate lived amongst the 80 patients being treated at Aspen Ranch, Utah. Instead of receiving any sort of therapy during his stay, Nate was the witness to numerous counts of physical, mental, and sexual abuse. Following a call for the patients to move from the cafeteria to the horse barn, one teenager, Dan, refused to move. Shortly after the defiant display, a sizable staff member entered the room. Like with many of these programs, a physical restraint method is utilized by staff when patients are disobedient. At Aspen Ranch, their positive control system consisted of multiple men and women twisting the arms of misbehaving teens behind their backs and pinning them, face down, on the ground. Dan was subject to this same treatment. However, the results were much more painful than usual. Upon being grappled by the large staff member, Dan was swept off his feet and dropped to the ground, the staff member following suit, falling on his arm and breaking one of Dan's wrists. Despite screaming in pain and begging for the staff member to let go, the counselor continued to apply more and more pressure. Proper medical attention was not provided until several hours later. As for psychological abuse, Aspen took a note out of Sinanon's book and utilized a modified version of a feedback group. Instead of break someone down in order to build them back up, Aspen would focus solely on the break someone down portion of feedback therapy. Staff members were encouraged to expose every minor detail, flaw, and insecurity of the target, and by routinely stealing letters from students, the staff had mountains of ammunition available. These sessions were public and almost used as entertainment for the staff, while the fellow patients watched and waited for their eventual turn. Meg's transition from home life to a more cult-like setting was abrupt. At age 15, during February 2001, she was abducted from her home by two strangers who simply told her to come with them. Forced to change her clothing in front of them, she redressed herself and was put in an SUV en route to a nearby airport. Meg later discovered that her parents had consulted 3 so-called experts before concluding that this unannounced abduction was the best course of action. Intermountain Children's Hospital in Boise, Idaho. Meg's introduction to this corrupt world within our own. Upon her arrival, staff took Meg's belongings to search for contraband of any kind. Relatively understandable if it weren't for the fact that of those belongings, her shoes were included. Meg would not receive them for another 3 days, and considering snow was still on the ground, you might imagine how this could be rather problematic for a young girl. Between her abduction in February and departure in August, Meg had put on an additional 60 pounds due to a lack of time for exercise and nothing but unhealthy food options. She had been prescribed medication for disorders she didn't even have, antipsychotics, mood stabilizers, and anti-seizure medication. Meg was forced to stay in her room for anywhere between 24 and 48 hours whenever group tidiness fell below satisfactory. During her stay, she received no family therapy of any kind. Staff would pin down troublesome patients, one on each limb and another pressing a knee on their back. Another staff member would come over to the scene and administer a sedative of some kind that would leave the child unable to fight back. Though this was only temporary, a more permanent solution was to tie the immobilized patient to the bed in what was known as the quiet room. It wasn't uncommon for the child inside of the room to be thrashing about from day until night, screaming to be let out. Thankfully for Meg, her time at Intermountain was comparably short-lived. Chrysalis, on the other hand, was a relatively different situation. As opposed to the institutional style Intermountain used, the Chrysalis approach was more family-orientated. The Chrysalis program consisted of 10 girls and 2 therapists, Mary and Kenny. Together, they would share a log cabin. The girls were taught to treat and think of each other as family. Like the others, Meg's story was of both physical, mental, and, at times, sexual abuse. But it was the person she left Chrysalis as that is most notable. The barrage of mental anguish which Meg and her Chrysalis sisters experienced carried on well into her life. Not as apparent trauma, but as a subtle reminder of the ill-intent teachings which she accepted as fact at Chrysalis. At age 19, Meg was accepted into college, presumably finished with Chrysalis and their teachings. But that belief proved to be false rather quickly. During her freshman year, she received an email from a familiar name. "I've heard that you've been partying. I needed to let you know that I heard about it, and I'm giving you a chance to respond to my concern if it's true. Love, Mary." Despite her days at Chrysalis being behind her, Meg responded to the email, expressing how sorry she had been and hoped for forgiveness. Even still, Meg hadn't seen anything wrong with her behavior until 33 years of age. One of her Chrysalis sisters took her own life. She suffered from all manner of illness and disorder. Chrysalis only aggravated her issues, driving her off the edge, and revealing to Meg just what sort of effects Chrysalis had on her well-being. With each survivor, a story comes with them, and with each story, the negligence and greed displayed by these organizations becomes ever more apparent. Between death and trauma, the lifelong effects that these programs have on children are, without a doubt, vile. Such occurrences continue to be somewhat prevalent today. These institutions continue to be poorly monitored and, for many, tax-exempt due to the inclusion of religious practices. Considering the absurd costs for students to remain in the care of these facilities in conjunction with their tax status, it becomes clear that the intent is to profit off of those who are incapable of defending themselves. The legacy of Synanon, forever immortalized by history and shamefully repeated to this very day. Thank you for your time and support, no matter how brief. Have a happy new year.